After e4, e5, knight f3 and knight c6, white plays d4, the Scotch game is on the board. So as mentioned in the previous video, you have to take the pawn, and after knight takes back, bishop to c5, double attack on the knight. So in the previous video we went through knight takes knight and queen f6 and everything that happens next. In this video we're going to go through one of the main moves, which is bishop to e3. Okay, very similar stuff here. You play queen to f7, tripling the attack on the knight in d4. So now white has a question to answer. There's four main moves now that we're going to be looking at: c3, knight to b5, knight takes knight, and knight f5. These are the four more popular moves. So let's start from knight b5. So this is a bad move basically. The white knight just removes itself from the square where it was being attacked too many times, and also goes for the threat of c7. Of course, now here we just take the bishop and we don't have to worry about the square c7, because when the knight goes to c7 you just move the king, you're attacking the knight, and the knight cannot go and take the rook because you've got queen f2 checkmate. So black is winning either material or the game. So after bishop takes in e3, what happens if pawn simply takes the bishop back, and now the white player is still attacking the square c7 with the knight? It's just too late because black plays queen to h4 check. And now what to do? Okay, well, king moving to d8 with the idea of potentially knight c3 and then developing the two major pieces and castle manually. Still, you have to realize that after king to d8, protecting the check square, the white player is left with the weakness of the double isolated pawn. And well, both players lost their right to castle. So let's look at this line: king to d2, king to d8, and now after knight to c3, black plays knight to e5. The knight is going to control these very crucial squares. So after queen e2, there's nowhere else really to go for that queen, and white needs to develop the queen and develop the rook and try the castle manually. We're going to clamp on the weakness, these two pawns. So now knight to f6, we have already double attack over that square, and there's no way for white to defend it. There's literally nothing, because remember, even if g3, remember you can play knight takes e4 with check. So if rook to d1 developing, after rook d1, a6, the knight will have to move. So after knight d4, here simply win a pawn. The white player will have to take the knight. If he goes away, you have potential knight f2 idea, or even knight c3 will be a fine move, although knight f2 is probably even better. So here after knight takes and queen takes back, there's nothing. White is a pawn down and the pawn is isolated, so black has already got a good advantage for the endgame. After king to c1, manually castling, rook to e8, we're gonna put too much attack over the square in e3. There's nothing to do for the white player. So for example, let's say, well, the bishop is stuck, so after rook to g1 to be able to play the pawns on the king side and potentially put the bishop in fianchetto with a tempo, black simply plays knight to g4, and now the attack over e3 is too much, so it cannot be defended more than twice at the same time. So for example, rook to d3 is not enough. You can just take knight takes e3, you're completely winning. So from the start, let's look at this line a little bit different this time. d4, take, knight takes, okay, bishop c5, bishop e3, queen f6. Now there's a lot of attack over the knight, and let's look one more time at this knight to b5 idea with the threat of going to c7. We have to take, and after takes back, queen check. What happens if g3? Okay, you take the pawn in e4 with an attack on the rook, and when the rook moves, you take the pawn with check, and black is simply up 2 pawns. White, there's no compensation for the white player, so you can just start swapping stuff even at this point. So in this position, after queen went to e4, attacking the rook just moved and we took the pawn. But what happens if the rook doesn't move, just stays there, and the knight goes on to c7 with a check? Well, now king to d8 attacking the knight, knight takes rook. And now cheeky move is knight to f6. We don't even care about recapturing the lost rook. First of all, this knight is trapped, is not going anywhere. So now there's two options we're going to be looking at. One of them is rook 1, in which case this loses because queen e3 comes with an attack on the rook just like before, but now the white player cannot impose a swap with the queens, for example, because our queen will not be pinned. The king is in d8, so we can just take the rook back. Besides, this knight is not going anywhere, and we have threat of developing the rook right away. So queen e3 now wins immediately. So in this position, after knight f6, what happens after knight to c3 attacking the queen? Well, now queen takes rook anyway, and after best moves queen to d6, providing a shelter for the knight, this is just pointless. Queen to f3 with an attack on e3. This is a very complicated line. So here the computer evaluates this position slightly better for black, but the white player will have to be a computer to carry on this game, because how is white going to defend this pawn and develop the rook at the same time? How is he going to make this bishop useful? And also, how is he actually going to save this knight? Knight going to c7 is not good enough because you're going to be taking this pawn. So let's make an example here. If you look at the engine, the best move by white is queen to c7 check, and after king to e7, the queen has given away the square of escape for the knight, so the knight is still trapped. But you can't really take it right away. So here the best move now is queen to f4. So that's actually very good, because you see in this position, if white had played knight to c7, as mentioned a second ago, white will lose because of queen e3, and there's like huge advantage for black, like position evaluated -4. And here, just remember, there's nothing. White doesn't have any checkmate or any tactic or anything. There's too many black pieces and pawns around this king, our king. So here, white gives a check in c7 so that the king goes to e7, and now, only now, the queen goes to f4. Because if the queen had gone to f4 right away asking for swap, we would have just swapped, and then this knight wouldn't have gone anywhere. But in this case, the white player, as mentioned, gives a check, king e7, removing the king away from the square c7, and now queen f4. And the best move for black is to swap. Queen takes, and after pawn takes, the best move by black is king to d8, depriving of the knight the possibility to go to the square c7 and find an escape. And at the end of this insane line, white castles queenside, and black's winning chances consist of trying to take this knight for real. Black's best move now is d5. Of course, we have to develop this bishop, and after development of the bishop, maybe king to d7, we might be able to finally win this knight. So in this position, how is it that the game is slightly better for black, even though it looks completely equal? Well, the thing is, it's actually slightly better for black only if white plays exactly like an engine all the way until the end, and this is actually very unlikely because the black player will inevitably win this knight. So after white playing only best top engine moves, this is the line that goes on. Knight to d5 now, winning a pawn, but now bishop to g4, going for an attack on the rook, meaning that we don't have to worry about the discover check of knight takes in f6 because we're going to take the rook. And this knight from f6, the white knight capturing our knight in f6, will not be making any threat or any Zwischenzug. So after best move, rook to d3, now we finally take the knight. Our bishop is developed, rook takes in d3, check, king to c8, we're going for the knight. And after still best moves, rook to g5, making a fork to our bishop and the pawn, bishop to e6, protecting the pawn. And here, two options, and then we will close this line. One of them is rook to g7, and then we just play king to b8. We're winning this knight, and still position is not entirely completely winning for black, even though we're up a piece, because white has a majority of pawns both on the queen side and the king side. But still, this is definitely, we are definitely on the winning side. And a couple of moves ago, you might think, what about f5 attacking the bishop? We don't have anywhere to put this bishop that makes sense. c4 gets taken, b3 gets taken, a2 of course is silly because b3 might trap the bishop. It's very dangerous. Yeah, we just go back to d7, and after rook to g7, this time this comes with an extra attack on the pawn in f7, but black now simply plays knight to f5, solidifying the defense of this pawn. And also this knight can never be attacked by any pawn ever. So the knight is there to stay, and he cannot be attacked by this bishop. And the plan of playing king b8 and take the knight is going on no matter what. Let's make a recap. d4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, take the pawn, knight takes, bishop c5, and after bishop e3, we have now the triple attack on the knight. So earlier we went through knight b5 variations. Let's look this time at what happens when the knight takes our knight in this specific situation. Okay, we take the bishop in e3, and after pawn takes back, we now go for the pawn in b2 and we trap the rook, forcing white to only play knight to d2, saving the rook. In this case, now we go on with d pawn recapturing the knight, and the black player is already up a pawn. This pawn in b2 is not poisoned, it's just fine. After rook to b1, just play the queen back to f6. You don't want to go too greedy and take the pawn in a2, but queen to f6, you're doing okay. After bishop to d3, developing the pieces, queen to h4, check. The bishop in e3 obviously is putting extra defense of the square e4, so after g3 now anyway, queen to e7, looks strange because he allows the white player to castle, but that was going to happen anyway. Look exactly at this variation and how the black player is already going for a comfortable endgame. This is a double isolated pawn, and these are two isolated pawns, not to mention that black is up a pawn. And blocking is actually safe. Let's make a few moves to see how it looks like now. Knight to f6, and after queen to f3, getting as active as possible. Black simply castles, and there's absolutely no reason for white to, after 12 moves, already give up any chances of playing a decent endgame. Nothing works here. Knight to c4 with the idea of pushing the pawn to e5. For example, black simply plays knight to d7, and there's just no counterattack. White doesn't have any counterattack. A move like a4 here wouldn't make much sense. You will just play knight to c5, but there's really nothing else that white can possibly do. e5 couldn't be pushed, it would be taken. This bishop cannot make any progress, and white doesn't have any single pawn push idea because no pawns are connected to each other. The only ones that are connected to each other will be these two, but you definitely don't want to push them. And even if you do, which you don't, but you're gonna go against a majority. So white has nothing. So okay, the knight is attacking the pawn. Let's say pawn to a5. Black's best move is pawn to b5. And now after pawn takes pawn ampersand, black will take back with the pawn in a, and it's got an open file for the rook. At this point, the position is evaluated -3 already, like black is up a piece. The black bishop is just going to be very strong soon. The rook is infiltrating in a2 as soon as we want to, so even if rook a1, suggesting a swap, still bishop to h3. This rook can't move to f2 due to the attack on the rook, and even if the rook were to take our rook, then we will just take back. We still have the threat on the rook. The rook cannot go down because of rook a1 is a deadly threat. The game might go on for a while, a little bit longer, but it's completely winning for black. So if the rook just moves to e1, simplify the game. Knight takes bishop, pawn takes back. It looks weird because we are uniting the pawn structure for our opponent, but now black plays b5. The knight is going to be misplaced. There's no way for the white rook to go to any square that can actually be productive. Knight to d2, okay, rook to a2, infiltrating. Soon enough we're gonna play queen b4, so there's no way for the knight to go anywhere that makes sense. If the queen tries to defend the knight, then queen b4, double attack on the knight. If the knight moves away, then queen to b2 makes too many threats on this rank. We do need to see more variations of these lines. These are gonna come throughout this video and throughout the following videos. Let's go on now with pawn takes, of course, knight takes, bishop c5, bishop to e3, and now queen to f6. Triple attack on the knight. Let's go on with this move, c3. This is very popular. It's one of the main moves. The idea is to put more defense over this knight, and white doesn't really want to start trading stuff, but rather keep the tension. Okay, then queen to g6, putting pressure on e4. Plenty of options are now possible. Let's just discuss the most important, because the g3, with the idea of putting the bishop in fianchetto, just plays a massive mistake. Queen e4, black is already much better. What else can white try to do? Well, if bishop to e2, ignoring the pawn and going on with development, you just play queen to g2, attacking the rook, and after bishop to f3, attacking the queen, queen to g6, the pawn in g2 is not poisoned, you just up a pawn. And now after developing moves, knight to d2, d6, queen to b3, the idea of castling long side, of course, so the white can make the rooks go on the g file, which looks actually quite interesting. Black just goes on with development, completely careless. Knight g to e7, and after long castle, now black plays queen to f6. So after rook h to g1, we are now gonna do the swaps in the center because we're winning in material with up a pawn, and we want to start simplifying stuff. Bishop takes. Now here the engine move will be bishop to g5, attacking the queen. We're gonna have to move the queen, but let's look just for a second at what happens after bishop takes back in d4 with an attack on the queen, and it looks like a skewer. It looks like the bishop can safely go to g7, and it's gonna be a problem. But of course we are gonna take the bishop. Knight takes, pawn takes back, queen takes back. Here once again we are still up a pawn. We're now up 2 pawns, and we are controlling the square g7, and there's nothing here for white, even though it looks like our queen is in a bit of a dangerous situation. It's all fine. So let's look at this situation for a second. Remember, before we said bishop g5 was the best move. Okay, black now plays queen to e5, and white will have to recapture the piece. Pawn takes, but still this just goes on. knight to d4, black is once again up another pawn, but after the engine move, queen to d3, now this black plays bishop to e6. There's nothing to worry here. Position is evaluated like minus 250 or something like that at this point. White's best move is king to b1, obviously, to avoid queen to c5, very dangerous check. Black now plays knight to c6. And of course, a move like knight c4 is not possible because you're putting pressure on f3. So first you can swap here, queen takes back, and then knight wins bishop. So that's not possible. White's best move would be a3 to stop idea like knight to b4. Really dangerous idea. Black goes on with h6, and after bishop to e3, long castle. We are now done with development. We have a crucial idea of playing d5 and swap the central pawn to have a rook on the open file. And here now we're gonna drop the line here. Black is like just completely winning according to engine evaluation. We've mentioned the ideas. Also, black is up 2 pawns. If white tries one more thing, bishop to f1, idea of playing f4, removing the bishop from the dangerous pressure of this knight. Well, still, we're going to play d5. We're not going to crack open the center. So f4 here, you just ignore the attack on the queen, play pawn take e4 with an attack on the opponent queen. Even after bishop takes e4, queen to h5 with the threat of playing knight e2, winning move because of the discovered attack on the queen and the knight's attack on the rook. And even if the queen were to play ultra safe and play something like queen to f1, black will simplify everything by playing bishop to f5, pinning the bishop to the king, imposing a swap, removing the bishop pair from our opponent, and go on to an easy winning endgame with the majority of pawns on both sides of the board. So let's make a recap. Knight f3, knight c6, d4, take, bishop c5, bishop e3, queen f6, and now c3. Okay, well, we switched the focus on the pawn in e4. So we went through a few options. We haven't looked at bishop to c4 now. For example, this is also met by queen taking the pawn in g2. And after queen to f3, forcing a swap because white is threatening to play queen f7. Queen takes, knight takes, bishop takes, and pawn takes gives a better endgame for the black player. Black is up a pawn and got much better pawn structure. So in this position, let's look at what we've tried. Bishop e2, bishop c4. What happens after queen f3? This looks like the most active move, defends the pawn, develops a piece. Okay, black goes on with knight g to e7, continuing development, and after bishop to c4, the queen is also defending g2, meaning that maybe it looks like white will be able to actually castle and play a normal game this time. However, black plays knight to e5, forking these two pieces. And after queen to e2, defending the bishop, bishop takes in d4, pawn takes back. It looks weird because we just gave the bishop pair and also allowed white a double pawn in the center. But still, now we're gonna take the bishop as well, so we also took our opponent's bishop pair away. And after queen takes back, now we take this famous pawn that we've been targeting so much in every one of these variations. Queen to g2, and now after rook to f1, only move obviously to save the rook. Queen also takes the pawn in e4. There's no compensation. Queen, the white player can only recapture some material by playing queen takes pawn in c7. That's true, but now queen to c6 forces a swap. Well, it doesn't really force a swap, but if white saves the queen, let's say for example, queen to g3, targeting a pawn in g7. Okay, queen to c2, targeting b2, trapping the rook. If queen takes in g7, we got nothing to worry because rook g8 attacks the queen. With the tempo, it's defended by the knight. After queen to e5, queen to b2, black is winning. Even if, okay, careful here, if white plays bishop to g5, threatening checkmate, the best move is rook takes in g5. And black is winning a lot of material here. In this position, we tried queen g3. What happens after queen a5? Okay, b6 attacking the queen. And after queen to d2, castle, knight to c3. Looks like this might be almost a normal game, but still, black is up a pawn, so we do have an advantage. Black now goes on with d5, and after rook to c1, rook to e8. The advantage of the black player also consists of the weakness of the unsafe king of our opponent. Position is evaluated almost -3. So it's like if black was almost up a piece. White's best move is rook to g1, placing the rook in a much more desirable square. And now black developed the bishop, and after knight to, well, careful, knight to e4 isn't really that much of a threat. It's threatening, I don't know, a few things, knight f6. So you have to be careful where you put the queen. Queen to e6 is the best move. You still defend the bishop. Yeah, there's an attack from the rook to the queen, so you have to move the queen, but you have to be careful because knight f6 will have won the bishop, so queen e6 is the best move. There's nothing here for the white player, even if knight to g5, attacking the queen, becoming more annoying. Queen to f6, and the black player is ready to play knight to f5, increasing the pressure over this bishop in e3 with the pin. And let's close the line by showing this move, rook to c7, putting the rook on the 7th rank, queen to d6, attacking the rook, and queen to c2, defending the rook whilst threatening check, a very dangerous check in h7, g6 obviously, and now nothing stops the black player, let's say h4, nothing stops us from playing knight to f5 and capitalize on this weakness.